Okay, so recently leaks emerged revealing a potential specification for Sony's upcoming PlayStation 5 Pro, completely unconfirmed. No idea if this is actually happening. However, the source is Tom Henderson, who has correctly predicted the Q Project Q handheld. So he's got the credentials. He's also predicted a PlayStation 5 with a detachable Blu-ray drive. So yeah, basically, if that detachable Blu-ray drive comes along, we should be expecting that the Pro will come along. I'm going to go to you first of all, John. But before we do, there's this question from supporter Gatti, and it kind of accurately represents some of the discussions we've been having about the whole concept of a pro console for this generation. And the question is, in the most recent PlayStation showcase, Jim Ryan said, and I quote, developers are just scratching the surface of what's possible with the gaming experiences that they create. I understand it's mostly a marketing phase, but saying that in the third year of PS5's life cycle, does it not paint the whole idea of PS5 Pro even more confusing? Do you think it will be a product in search of a problem to solve, assuming the problem is not 8K gaming? What do you reckon?
This is kind of a weird thing, and I'm very curious as to the purpose of a product like this, because we're kind of in that state where the PS5 itself just hasn't really, it kind of feels like we're still starting this generation, right? Like we've talked about this before, where we're just starting to see some games take advantage of it, although we did see some earlier on, and then it kind of went back to cross-gen. And I feel like, unlike last time with the PS4 Pro, which did have that purpose of targeting 4K displays, which were becoming more widespread, 8K is not the problem to solve, as 8K displays have not become commonplace. And I think they're mostly undesirable still, I would say. Like, they're interesting, but it basically means everything will be upscaled, which you don't necessarily want, right? So I think this time the only way they could really sell it is to take more of an iterative approach, kind of tapping further down the cell phone road, I suppose, where it's like, this is just a more powerful box. They already promised 4K, and well, technically they promised 8K with the PS5, right? Though they did not deliver on that. So this is basically just like, well, here's an upgrade, like you'd upgrade your phone. Here's a more powerful machine. It's like upgrading a GPU. I think with the release of all these other products in different categories, like graphics cards and phones, people have become somewhat more accustomed to just upgrading their hardware, and I feel like if this comes out in late 2024, that will have been 4 years since the launch of PlayStation 5, which is still a decent amount of time between upgrades. And that would actually make, if this happens, it would still have, there'd be a larger gap between PS5 and PS5 Pro than there was between PS4 and PS4 Pro, right? That was 3 years, because that was 2016. So I think it's a fair ask. It's just, I'm really, it's such a,
You're struggling.
I'm struggling with it because it just doesn't seem that compelling to me.
Right. Well, we've got an interesting question here from supporter Dirk Hodderin. Hear me out. I think Remnant 2 just made the strongest case for a PS5 Pro, yeah. With its uncapped performance mode going as low as 720p, not even the best implementation of DLSS can prevent that from looking bad on increasingly large 4K TV screens. If this is indicative of the kind of performance cost Nanite is likely to command, then I fear by the end of the generation, base PlayStation 5 is going to be running games at resolutions that would make the PS3 blush. Thoughts on that one, Oliver? I think, well, before you come in on that one, Unreal Engine 5 is basically a work in progress. It's getting better and better all the time. And the Unreal Engine 5 games that we would have, that we're seeing now would have been developed on a much older version. I'm not entirely sure that you can set your store based on Remnant 2. But what do you reckon about this one, Oliver?
Well, I think the first thing to get out of the way is that Remnant 2 indeed, at least as we counted, it does go down to 720p class resolutions in its higher performance modes. But the actual experience on a real display is not like 720p. It's a lot closer to 1440p, right? Based on our coverage. So it is upsampling very effectively. You do get more breakup in motion, but to some degree that's masked by the motion blur. So it's really much more like 1440p. And to me, at least, from a normal viewing distance, 1440p still looks very good in a 4K set, or can look very good, at least if it's quite temporally stable, I think. I do think it probably does indicate that UE5, at least in this state, is very heavy, especially when you start pouring in nanite and VSMs and all that stuff. Especially if you look at the game on PC, it really does collapse a little bit when you hit those higher shadow settings. So,
Right.
I mean, it would definitely help, but also developers are going to be targeting the PlayStation 5 as the most common platform, and also the Series S as a baseline kind of platform. So I don't think the existence of, like, let's say 10 million PS5 Pros or 15 million by the end of the generation really does that much. I think UE5 needs to scale to those lower power platforms regardless of what the Pro is doing, right? Even if it is really good.
Actually, Oliver, that's a really good point. And this is in the fact that there is actually a use case for this product more than I had considered. And it's the fact that by still needing to target these lower end platforms, especially with the PS5 as a base in the PlayStation side, one can assume that they will not be able to take full advantage in the way that you would think for a PS5 Pro in terms of building games just for that spec. Instead, that would just allow them to basically solve these image quality problems and performance problems for Unreal Engine 5 and other more demanding technologies in the way. So it does kind of ensures that. So right now we're seeing the switch between 60 to 30 frames per second is becoming standard again, somewhat, I would say. It hasn't truly reached that point. We're still seeing performance modes, but I feel like 30 is becoming more common, just as we kind of suspected earlier on. Whereas I think with the upgrades we're seeing on these PS5 Pro specs, this could essentially alleviate that problem and allow it to reach 60 frames per second more easily, and maybe even 120 frames per second. So as these Unreal Engine 5 games begin to roll out with all these new features, because they need to target those older machines, it makes it a lot more feasible to just take what they've built already and just increase the frame rate. Maybe some slight boost to fidelity, but not enough to bring the frame rate down. So this might be our ticket to more 60 frames per second UE5 games. Although, you know, with the most talented developers, I would still expect 60 FPS anyways. Like, I don't know what the Coalition has in store, but I would imagine that their game will, in fact, target 60 frames per second and likely feature all of these UE5 bells and whistles. Well, on Xbox, of course, not on PlayStation, but you know what I mean. So, but I think a lot of developers are going to struggle with getting really performant results out of UE5. Especially in these first couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's take a look at Tom Henderson's actual report on his Key to Gaming website. There's actually sort of like only one or two lines of actual detail about the product. There is a lot of padding surrounding it. Let's talk about the details here. He's talking about 30 WGPs and 18,000 megatransfers per second memory. So yeah, that basically translates into more commonly understood parlance as 60 compute units versus the 36 that are currently in the PlayStation 5. 18 gigabits per second memory. I think the PlayStation 5's current memory speed, 14 gigabits per second. So yes, that's quite interesting. Lots of questions about that. First of all, you know, going from 36 to 60 compute units, that is a tangible bump. The question is whether we're going to get all of those 60 compute units in the final shipping product. Because, well, you know, to be honest, it's a case where certain chips are defective on the production line, and to make those chips viable, they deactivate parts of the GPU. And if you're going to do that, you've got to do it on all the chips of the production line. So possibly it could be lower than 60 compute units, but possibly not. We just don't know at the moment. We don't know the architecture. Is it RDNA 2? Is it RDNA 3? Is it some sort of weird hybrid like we saw with the PlayStation 4 Pro, which had a lot of Vega architectural features sort of backported to earlier versions of GCN and then put into this chip. We don't know anything about the CPU side of things, which brings up another interesting question from supporter. Let me check this out. Struggling Shader. From what I've seen, the PS5 Pro leak talks about only GPU and memory. But from my perspective, the main bottleneck we're seeing is CPU. What is the best way to increase CPU performance without breaking compatibility? Only clocks, or could we have some 3D style V cache added to the Zen 2 cluster? So we're talking about things that are actually plausible for a console here. If we look at what the Pro did, it basically just kept the existing CPU and upclocked it by about 30%. Possibly the same thing could be happening here. However, one thing that we have seen, I mean, when I actually spoke to Mark Cerny about PS4 Pro, he was talking about they kept to the Jaguar cores in PS4 Pro for compatibility purposes, but they seem to have overcome any compatibility issues when they moved to Zen 2 for PS5. So conservatively speaking, I would expect them to stick with Zen 2 but increase the clock speeds. However, possibly there is the option to move to Zen 4 or even a more later architecture. It all depends really on compatibility and die area specifically. The thing that's sort of, well, first of all, I do think that these specs are kind of plausible, and there's another guy on Twitter, a known leaker of AMD hardware specifications, Kepler_L2, says it's real, says the chip is codenamed Viola, and has basically corroborated Tom Henderson's report. He says it's the only real PlayStation 5 Pro report out there at the moment. What's sort of bothering me a little bit about this 60 compute unit situation is that if you look at compatibility, Sony has taken a hardware-driven approach. So, PS4 to PS4 Pro, they doubled the GPU size, but it enabled them to have perfect compatibility with PlayStation 4. PlayStation 4 Pro to PlayStation 5, they kept the same amount of compute units, right? But obviously the compute unit itself was overhauled, massive clock speed boosts. To do the same trick on a PS5 Pro, to have this sort of symmetrical hardware, you'd be looking at an 80 CU part, which would be kind of nuts. And if we're reporting 60 compute units in this chip, that would mean like 25% of them are being disabled, which doesn't make sense. So maybe Sony has moved on from this concept of pure hardware compatibility. Maybe there's something new that's going on here. The memory kind of makes sense. You'd want more memory bandwidth for a faster GPU. I'm not sure there's going to be more memory as such because, what do you need it for? The original PlayStation 5 is already targeting 4K textures, right? So it's just going to be extra brute force. Other stuff that's happening in the...
well, Rich, what about 8K they keep talking about? I mean...
Well, let's as I said, let's look at the key to gaming things that they're talking about here. They're talking about improved and consistent frames FPS at 4K resolution, which kind of goes without saying, right? And they're talking about a new performance mode for 8K resolution, when really I think we'd all be very happy with an actual performance mode for 4K resolution.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
one that actually works. How they're going to do this performance mode, who knows? And accelerated ray tracing, which may or may not be part of clock speed boosts. We don't know the clock speeds. That's of crucial importance. It may be through architectural advancements. It may be that, Mark Cerny's come up with his own ray tracing hardware design that's entirely bespoke for consoles, but is a great fit for consoles. Might not end up in the PC space. There's been a lot of stuff that's happened in PlayStation consoles. So checkerboarding hardware, for example, that never made its way into the PC space because it kind of wasn't needed.
One interesting thing I just thought about was so again with 8K, right? Do you recall when the PS4 Pro launched, they updated the firmware on the base PS4 to finally allow HDR support on that system as well? So I'm wondering if perhaps we'll finally get like 8K output, at least as an option on the regular PS5, as the box promised. Obviously, native 8K rendering in general would be ridiculous and I don't think it's that feasible for most games, but I mean, they could have an 8K upscale option, right? like where it just sends an 8K signal to your display. But that then it just comes down to where do you want the processing of the image to happen, the PS5 or your TV, right?
Well, this week it was announced that 40 million PlayStation 5s have now sold, right? All of them, every single box, all 40 million of those boxes have got 8K on them.
Yep.
And 3 years on,
Nothing.
there's no 8K support for the PlayStation 5 at all. So maybe at some point it will be enabled, right? But that one is kind of baffling to me. It's just really, really weird, right? Because the PlayStation 4 Pro had a reason to exist, right? It had several reasons. First of all, in theory, it was a much better fit for PlayStation VR than the base box, right? So if PlayStation VR had taken off in a significant manner, I think we could have seen more impressive VR support for PSVR 2. Secondly, it did a fairly creditable job of delivering a 4K experience, right? Horizon, God of War. It's not ideal, but it looks decent on a 4K display, right? 8K isn't a good enough reason for a PS5 Pro. You can't sell it. So I think it is ultimately going to be about performance. But Oliver, I think you'd agree that there is going to be a subset of the audience out there who will just want the fastest PlayStation possible, right?
Well, I'm very much part of that audience for sure. PlayStation 5 that's roughly twice as fast, in line with the PS4 Pro kind of style upgrade. I'm definitely interested in that personally, although maybe that's a relatively small component of the market. I think that there are definitely, three key problems that face the PS5 Pro in terms of marketing. Because if you're looking at targeting higher resolutions, the PS5 is already targeting 4K displays and does a reasonably creditable job of doing that. You can do a better job, certainly, but I don't know how much of a back-of-the-box marketing feature that is. Do you target higher frame rates? Well, you might have a 2x boost in GP performance, but you don't have a 2x boost in CP performance. By all likelihood, it's going to be probably a clock bump. That's where the majority of the performance gain will probably come from, I think. And then do you enhance ray tracing? Well, a lot of games are built around a certain set of RT features, and then if you add some more in there, maybe that's not that big of an impact. So it does seem like a box with more power that's sort of up to the developer to figure out what they're going to do with it, whereas the PS4 Pro was very specifically, buy this box if you want to play this on a 4K TV, and that was very effective marketing, and I think it conveyed the value of the product, and people purchased it, and it did do a decent job of addressing 4K displays. And the whole 8K thing is a little bit of a pie in the sky thing, because 8K it's so hard to perceive the difference, at least from what I've seen in demos, from 8K to 4K at normal viewing distances. The visual acuity of the human eye is not is not that good.
I mean, I've got an 8K
think the sets
TV, so
yeah.
I can tell you how it looks. It just looks like really good anti-aliasing.
Right, yeah.
You get really, really good image quality, but as you say, the further you are from the screen, there's sort of diminishing returns on it. It's kind of like, for bragging rights, it's absolutely incredible. I mean, this week on the DF supporter program, we've been experimenting with an HDMI 2.1 capture card. We got 8K 60 capture actually working.
That's wild.
And it does look kind of phenomenal, but it's, it required like a RTX 4090 to actually get decent results at 8K. And I'd be really interested to see what a quote unquote performance mode for 8K resolution looks like. Because I just think it's far more pertinent to the user to actually have a decent 4K experience. And I'm curious about what this performance mode could be, because the one thing that's sort of coming up as a result of this spec leak is that a lot of people are talking about that the spec isn't like, as much of a leap as they expected. Slightly disappointing. Thing is, there were exactly the same arguments leveled at the PS4 Pro, where the GPU is essentially an underclocked RX 470, and yet, it's got decent enhancements within there that actually made 4K possible. It was a worthwhile machine overall. The thing is, though, that there was a sort of degree of, I'm not going to say laziness, but there's a certain degree of the fact that developers didn't really have the bandwidth to accommodate all of these different SKUs. So we got a lot of games that ran at 1080p on the base machine and just with the same thing at 1440p on the Pro, which wasn't hugely, it was nice, but not hugely compelling.
Yeah. I think a lot of it does come down to as well what enhancements to the architecture we could see, because like if you look at the history of AMD GPU designs in consoles and PCs, you see a lot of cross-pollination. Like Vega in PS4 Pro, the 360 Xenos chip had a lot of terascale features, like unified shaders, and it wouldn't be surprising to me if the hypothetical PS5 Pro included some RDNA 3 hardware or features, or included some RDNA 4 potentially hardware features, because the consoles often kind of lead the GPU design in the PC, and there's a lot of cross-pollination there, even if it's not the exact same thing. So I think, that's kind of a bit of a black box, because we don't really know what's going on at AMD with respect to something like RDNA 4. But if there is like, just pie in the sky, for instance, say there is like a hardware acceleration for FSR3, and suppose that FSR3 is good, that changes the game with respect to a potential PS5 Pro, if it does indeed have that feature in hardware, right? So you could see some.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, given that the sort of upscaling techniques, DLSS took off when when PS5 and Series X and S were already well into development, right? AMD kind of had to play catch up with FSR too. And I could conceivably see a situation where, Sony's going back to AMD and they're kind of working on a way to solve this, to make this better and faster. If they can get, not to say that they can actually match DLSS so quickly, but I could see them looking at something like DLSS and saying, we want to achieve this in our console, and we want to implement the hardware to make it feasible, especially if you put 8K on the box and actually make it happen, right? You could conceivably then reach an 8K output that looks reasonably okay. And it would also ensure that the 4K output would look great no matter what.
You know what? I still see frame gen as a better fit for 120 hertz than for 60 hertz.
I 100% agree. And if you're right, if FSR3's frame gen features that they've been talking about come to fruition in this console, that could actually be a very powerful tool for reaching 120 frames per second as well.
Yeah, but I wouldn't underestimate Sony's input into this. I mean, 2016, we had the PlayStation 4 Pro with checkerboard rendering, and AMD had nothing like it. Their own upscaling solution that arrived like years later was a basic spatial upscaler, and then we finally got FSR2, right? But Sony was just way ahead of the game in that particular regard, with custom hardware, which was entirely sourced by them, and AMD implemented it. But of course, there were software solutions by that point as well. And of course, there was temporal injection. We saw Insomniac's solution for Marvel's Spider-Man at the PS4 Pro launch, and it looked phenomenal. So, yeah, I mean, we're looking at the specs, but the experience could be something quite different. But that said, I agree with you, Oliver, that there's plenty of scope for Sony to dig into the AMD roadmap and take out some of those features. I mean, RDNA 3 has got dual issue FP32, which is why we're seeing these crazy teraflop figures for RDNA 3. It doesn't seem to do much in the PC space, but it could be quite beneficial within a fixed platform like a console, right? And I'm sure there's more coming. RDNA 4 is en route, and there's the scope there for a product that will do things that the PlayStation 5 simply can't do. But just to sort of bring this discussion in a sort of circular way back to the beginning, why does this machine exist? I mean, how do you get success in the console market? And you do it by getting as many machines out there at as low a price as possible. So, this machine has got to justify a premium price point, while at the same time, the base machine has got to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And we'll talk about some of the crazy deals that are happening with PS5 shortly. There's just a lot going on there. But what can I say? I'm really interested to see what this is going to actually deliver beyond the specifications, because that's just the starting point, right? That's the starting point of the discussion, and it really does feel like a sort of deja vu experience compared to when we first got the specs for the PS4 Pro, which is like, this is interesting, but what's it actually going to do? That this base machine doesn't do already, apart from having a faster GPU? You know, there were big questions there, and it wasn't until we actually had the presentation that we started to see some amazing stuff. So
I do actually have one thought on one further justification that we haven't discussed so far that might actually make this machine a bit more compelling, which is backwards compatibility on the PlayStation 6. Because last generation we had the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X, which hit a 4K visual target, or we're aiming for a 4K visual target. And then on PlayStation 5 and Series X, you bring those enhancements forward, right? And it also makes it easier to deliver 60 frames per second versions of those existing titles that might have hit 4K 30 on the old consoles. And if you presume that Sony sticks with AMD hardware, that's going to give them a big advantage with some of these older titles that may not get updates, right? But might be released in the last 3 or 4 years of that console's life cycle. It also puts Microsoft in a bit of an awkward position if they're not delivering a similar kind of enhanced machine.
I mean, Microsoft's whole business model seems to be shifting. The hardware is no longer the focus, right? So I think they can certainly get away with not releasing a competing machine with this, especially given that they already have 2 machines in the market. Adding a third one to the mix, I think, would be challenging, especially for developers, right? Because then, presuming this is real, that would mean 5 bespoke current generation consoles, which, yeah.
Yeah, there's an interesting discussion adjacent to this, which is what is happening with Xbox hardware at the moment. It doesn't seem to be having a lot of momentum being put behind it, right? I mean, hopefully the software will drive that momentum because they've got some great stuff coming up. But, you know, it's like your Furious fanboy mentioned last week. You know, they don't seem to be doing much with that opportunity when it actually comes to hardware. And yeah, it's actually seems to be quite tricky to get an Xbox at the moment, suggesting that they're not focusing on getting hardware out there, which is problematic, I think. But yeah, I mean, that's a completely different discussion. Mm-hmm. The concept of Sony releasing a Pro console and Microsoft not doesn't look great, I don't think.
I feel like the only leak we're missing is we need the confirmation of Mantis Burns Racing 2 just in time for PS5 Pro. I think that would complete the circle.
That is a really interesting thing, right? That's a bit of a deep cut there, John.
Yeah, 8K 60.
That's right.
It probably would be.
Exactly. It would be 8K 60. That's what we're counting on here.
For those that don't get that reference, we actually saw a PS4 Pro game and indeed a PS4 Pro dev kit, I think, ahead of... It might have been actually after the reveal, but before the deep dives. Yeah, Mantis Burn Racing, native 4K PS4 Pros. Yeah,
I think that was one of the
game.
big first tests you did in terms of capturing at 4K. It's like,
I went to the developer.
Yeah, you went to the developer with your gear. It's like, can we capture this native 4K 60 game on a PS4 Pro? And you did.
Yeah, we did. And it was very, very reminiscent of the experiences I'm having now with 8K, where you need like gigantic levels of bandwidth because we can't compress it, can't compress the footage. Man, yeah, happy days. Thankfully, we got there in the end. But yeah, I mean, let's just tie a bow on this. PlayStation 5 Pro, we're going to be obviously following up any and all rumours and credible leaks as they appear. So yeah, do please stay tuned.